Hello, I'm Lisa Harker, Director of the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory. Welcome to this webinar on recurrent care proceedings. It's the fifth webinar in a series brought to you by the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory and the Judicial College. Over the next 90 minutes, we'll be looking at recurrent care proceedings, the term used to describe the cycle when parents repeatedly appear in the family court, losing multiple children to public or kinship care or to adoption. There's a growing body of evidence on the prevalence of recurrent care proceedings in England and Wales, as well as the circumstances of mothers and fathers involved. Research is also telling us more about the impact that having children removed in this way has on parents. But importantly, there's also evidence about effective ways to work with mothers and fathers who've experienced recurrent care proceedings, and those parents who are at risk of doing so. During this webinar, we'll be presenting existing research on recurrence, drawing out the key messages and the points raised for reflection. We will hear from mothers who have been involved in care proceedings. They will share their experiences and talk about the support that has or might have made a difference to them and their children. We'll also look at a range of support available, and professionals will tell us about some of the services that support mothers and fathers and why they think they are proving effective. Sir Andrew McFarlane, President of the Family Division, will also provide his reflections. But first, Sir James Munby, Chair of the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory, will now introduce the session.
Welcome to this Nuffield Family Justice Observatory webinar series for the Judicial College. The Nuffield Family Justice Observatory was established by the Nuffield Foundation in 2019 to improve the lives of children and their families by putting data and evidence at the heart of the family justice system. All the people who work within the family justice system, judges, lawyers, social workers, Kafkas guardians, policymakers, and more, share a common goal: helping children and their families to thrive in the future. But understanding how to achieve that ambition is limited by a lack of readily available data and research evidence, and too few opportunities exist for those involved to share their knowledge and experiences. The Observatory exists to find and fill the gaps in our understanding of the family justice system, to highlight the areas where change will have the biggest impact, and to foster collaboration to make that change happen. The centre of its lens is on the family courts, but its focus extends far beyond this. To understand the support that children and families need before they reach family courts, and what happens after they've been through the family justice system. It is entirely independent, working with leading academics, reviewing evidence from around the world, and commissioning new research where it is needed. During the pandemic, it has swiftly turned its lens on the impact of COVID-19 on the family justice system, hearing from those experiencing the issues firsthand, not just professionals, but also importantly families, and identifying the opportunities and challenges abrupt changes to practice have offered up. Throughout this series, you will hear from a range of experts and others with experience of the family justice system on a range of issues, from the immediate impact of COVID-19 on hearings in the family court, to how best to manage contact between children in care or adopted and their birth families, and more. As a family judge, I need no persuasion of the importance of the Judicial College. In my new role with the Observatory, I have rapidly come to appreciate not only the importance of research, but also just how valuable it is in illuminating much that is obscure in the working of the family justice system, and in enabling us to see how things can be improved. I hope that this webinar series will be the beginning of a long and fruitful collaboration between the College and the Observatory.
Thank you, Sir James Munby. Today's event is being run in collaboration with Research in Practice, which has worked in partnership with PAWS, Lancaster University, the University of Essex, and the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory to set up an online community of practice for services working with parents who've experienced more than one set of care proceedings. This work has been funded by Public Health England. The Supporting Parents Community of Practice website contains a wide range of research and practice information, including resources such as videos, podcasts, links to research and policy publications, and a map of services. We'll hear more about this later, and in this short overview of recurrent proceedings, which now follows.
1 in 4 mothers who appear in care proceedings will reappear in subsequent proceedings within 7 years. Fathers also experience this cycle of recurrent care proceedings, although at nearly half the rate of mothers. Reducing the likelihood of a parent having further children removed from their care is an urgent priority, for the sake of children, mothers, fathers, and to reduce pressures on the family justice system. Mothers and fathers involved in recurrent care proceedings are very likely to have experienced significant adverse experiences in their own childhoods, such as abuse and neglect, or exposure to domestic abuse, and are likely themselves to have been in the care system as children. These experiences increase the likelihood of mental health, substance misuse, and other health issues in adulthood. They are also more likely to be impacted by housing problems, poverty, and economic instability. Complex and unresolved trauma throughout childhood and into adulthood is then compounded by the trauma of having their own children removed. Existing mental health difficulties can be exacerbated, along with problems with alcohol or drugs. This can lead to parents being seen as hard to reach or difficult to engage. For fathers, this often means being quickly identified as risky rather than vulnerable. But change is always possible if parents get the help they need at the right time. Services can offer support in pregnancy and during care proceedings, as well as afterwards. Services are most effective when they build relationships between parents and professionals, are persistent in getting parents to engage and accepting that they will make wrong choices, offer practical as well as emotional support tailored to individual needs, are trauma-informed and aware of loss and grief, are empathetic, honest, and hopeful. Supporting Parents is an online community of practice for organisations providing support to mothers and fathers who've had previous children removed. View our map of support services across England and Wales at supportingparents.researchinpractice.org.uk.
Before we hear more from researchers, parents and professionals, I'd like to say a few words about the format of today's event. There are many of you attending, and while we won't be able to see you during the event, we do want to hear from you. So please share your experiences in the chat tab. We'll also be putting questions to our discussion panel during the last 30 minutes of the webinar, so please put any questions you'd like to see raised in the Q&A tab. All the comments and the questions will be read by the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory team, helping to shape future research and webinars. We are recording today's event, and it'll be available via the Judicial College and our own website if you'd like to revisit any of the content. I'm going to hand over to Claire Mason, Senior Research Associate at Lancaster University, and Dr.Georgia Phillip, Lecturer in Social Work at the University of East Anglia. They're going to present key research findings on mothers and fathers involved in recurrent care proceedings. We start with a presentation from Claire.
I'm going to talk about a study that we published in 2017 called Vulnerable Birth Mothers and Recurrent Care Proceedings. There was long-standing anecdotal evidence that a percentage of mothers returned to court. However, a lack of longitudinal study and the fact that public law cases audits largely were cross-sectional meant that we didn't really understand this kind of longitudinal pattern for families who reappear in the family justice system. And in order to understand recurrence, you have to be able to take a longitudinal picture because it's a sequence problem. The study was led by Professor Karen Broadhurst, and as you'll see on the screen now, had an extensive team, and Dr. Bashar Alru and Dr. Stuart Bedston led the quantitative elements of the study. The study comprised 3 data sets. Data set A took all care proceedings in England over a 7-year period. And through the CAFCAS case management data, we were able to track 65,000 women over a period of 7 years. Data set B was a qualitative data set and involved interviews with 72 birth mothers who'd been through recurrent care proceedings. And finally, data set C was an in-depth court file review of all the children of a subset of 354 women. So in total, that was over 800 sets of proceedings. So by putting these 3 data sets together, we were able to get a really detailed understanding of the issue of mothers in recurrent care proceedings in England. So to start off with, I'm going to talk about the findings from the quantitative element. Our first analysis and update has shown that approximately 25% of mothers return to court within 7 years of their index proceedings, i.e. the first time they appeared in the dataset. When they do reappear, mothers are much more likely to enter proceedings with a very young child. 60% of their first repeat proceedings involved a child under 4 weeks, and 70% of those children are under the age of a year. 25% of the proceedings overlapped, i.e. they were issued with a subsequent set of proceedings before the final hearing of an earlier set of proceedings, and a further 35% within 1 year of a final hearing. And the reason that this is important is because if we think about the space in which we are trying to intervene being so small, such a small window, it leaves mothers with very little time to demonstrate a change in their circumstances to the courts. Our case file analysis and the findings from the qualitative interviews really demonstrated the significant problems that women had faced in their own childhoods. They had high levels of maltreatment and neglect, most commonly at the hands of their own caregivers, but also were victims of secondary harm in their wider community. So, for example, sexual exploitation, bullying at school were common. So, if we think about this child's journey through the system into adulthood, they may have appeared as a child with behaviour problems in a school environment. There may have then been an adolescent who was not in education or employment. They may have appeared as an adolescent with antisocial behaviour. Later in their lives, they may have the label of a substance misuser and be accessing treatment services. Commonly, women were victims of domestic abuse. We know that 64% of these women entered parenthood as a teenager. We know that they had significant levels of mental health problems tracked back into their teenage years. And then we see them in children's social care as parents for whom we have concern. So through their journey through services, they may be appearing with lots of different labels and lots of different interventions. However, what we can see from their own accounts is the bit that's often missing is an understanding of complex trauma. And certainly our work with Dr. Mike Shaw and Dr. Sheena Webb has really helped us to think about this. Also, significantly, 54% of the women had experienced out-of-home care, with 40% of them being formally looked after by the state. Many of them had entered care over the age of 10, and their care experiences were dominated by multiple placement moves, so a real lack of secure base in their own childhoods. So perhaps understanding then that they then appear with significant mental health and psychological problems. And when they appear in proceedings, often through the course of care proceedings, there are expert psychological assessments that recommend that they need specific psychological therapies. However, what we hear from the women's own accounts is that post-proceedings, their access to those psychological services are really difficult. Access to appropriate and timely mental health is a huge challenge to this cohort of mothers. All too often, there was an inappropriate response or no response at all, and mothers frequently fell through the net of services because of thresholds, because of criteria for those services, or because of waiting lists. So we have a situation where the family courts might deem their mental health not good enough for them to parent. However, it's not deemed as bad enough for them to be able to access these adult mental health services, which really leaves women in a kind of no-win situation, particularly if they then reappear before the courts not having received those psychological services. From the case files, we can see that non-engagement was the most commonly cited concern by professionals. It sat alongside other concerns, but non-engagement is the most commonly cited concern. And again, it leads us to really ask the questions about what do we mean by non-engagement and whose responsibility is it to engage? We know from the specialist recurrent care services that have developed in many local authorities and charities since the publication of this report, that with the right approach to engagement, women are receiving support, and the impact of that intensive support has been positive in many cases. So perhaps we need to rethink non-engagement and see it not as a rational choice not to engage with service, but more as an adaptive response to histories of complex trauma. And how do we take the learning from these specialist recurrent care services and equip professionals across the family justice system to offer services in a more appropriate way to this cohort of parents?
I've worked on two major Nuffield funded projects on fathers' experiences of child and family social work and family justice. The project I'll talk about today was a study of fathers and recurrent care proceedings, running from 2017 to 2020 and entitled Up Against It. This project was a collaboration between UEA and Lancaster University, led by Professors Marion Brandon and Karen Broadhurst. I was the project manager and a lead researcher on the qualitative longitudinal study, which formed one of three strands of the project. Up Against It is the first investigation of fathers and recurrence and builds the evidence base alongside the important work already completed on mothers. In what follows, I will briefly give an overview of the different strands of the project and then present some key findings and practice and policy messages arising from the research. As part of this, I will share two key themes from the qualitative work that provide particular and pertinent insight into the experiences of recurrent fathers. So our study was a mixed methods project involving 20 participating local authorities and 8 voluntary organisations from a wide geographic spread across England. The first strand of work provides a population level picture of fathers in first and repeat care proceedings. We undertook statistical analysis of administrative data held by CAFCAS on all formal care proceedings cases brought by local authorities in England between 2010-11 and 2017-18. So for the first time, we looked at patterns and trends for fathers in first and repeat proceedings in comparison with mothers. And key elements of this were not just the numbers of fathers or the rate and risk of recurrence, but also an analysis of how or with whom fathers and mothers return to court. The second strand of the project involved a survey of fathers involved in care proceedings across 18 participating local authorities. This consisted of a two-part paper-based questionnaire, one part for the father and one part for a practitioner involved in the case, and the number of completed surveys was 127. And this produced a first indicative picture of characteristics and circumstances relating to fathers and care proceedings. The third strand of the project consisted of a qualitative longitudinal or QL study of 26 men's experiences of recurrent child loss. This involved 2 in-depth interviews at the start and end of the study period and monthly phone calls in between over a period of 12 months. The QL study covered all aspects of the men's lives and their histories and their encounters with services. And we felt that the QL study added real value in following men's lives over time, to gain insight and also to map change and a sense of factors related to that change. Lastly, over the life of the project, we formed a learning network and held focus groups with practitioners in participating organisations. And the reason for that was to sense check early findings and to share practice experiences. The points on the next 2 slides are drawn from the analysis of the court data and from the survey. We found an increase in overall numbers of care proceedings cases over the 7-year time period, with parallel trends for fathers and mothers, both increasing but consistently more mothers than fathers, so a gender gap that did not close over time. While there are missing fathers in care proceedings, so cases where mothers appear alone with no father recorded, in 80% of cases, the father was known and named as a party to those proceedings. So we suggest that this means there is work to do to address both the 20% of missing fathers, but also to fully and fairly engage with the visible 80%. The court data doesn't really tell us about engagement. Fathers had a much lower rate of entering subsequent or repeat care proceedings than mothers, nearly half that of mothers. So after 5 years, we saw that 22% of mothers had returned to court, while for fathers, we saw it was 12%. But nonetheless, this means that significant numbers of fathers do return to court in a second or repeat case of care proceedings. Of fathers who do return to court, 3 out of 4, or 79%, do so with the same partner. Recurrent couples and families are a real part of the picture of recurrence, particularly for men. We suggest there's a need to reframe certain stereotypes about fathers, such as fecklessness or absence, and we also need to work with couples. We also looked at factors affecting the likelihood of recurrence for fathers. Parents' age and age of child at first proceedings are factors affecting recurrence. Younger parents and parents of younger children are more at risk of returning, and it's vital to recognise that the removal of babies into care impacts on fathers too. We identified other factors significant to recurrence for fathers. So compared with fathers with a single appearance in care proceedings, recurrent fathers were more likely to have been looked after as a child, to have experienced multiple childhood adversities, to be unemployed, and to be not living with their youngest child. So our findings suggest an association between cumulative and complex adversity and father's appearance in repeat care proceedings, but not a straightforward or causal link. The next findings relate predominantly to the qualitative longitudinal study, but are also supported by the survey data. So following these fathers' lives over time demonstrated a clear need for bespoke and longer-term support for men where children are removed, to mitigate the harmful coping strategies which further exclude them from being seen as suitable fathers or partners in the future, or from reclaiming fatherhood with existing children. The pattern of recurrent fathers with unresolved childhood trauma that absolutely blights capacity for emotional regulation, for forming nurturing relationships, and for family functioning was hugely notable. There is an urgent need for services to engage with this. There are already powerful examples of highly skilled, sensitive, and strengths-based work being developed for mothers, but there simply is not the equivalent service response for fathers. Fathers and couples need resources and support to manage emotions and relationships differently. Without this, couple conflict or worse, abusive behaviour and its impact on parenting remains a key factor in families becoming stuck in a cycle of recurrence. So the next two slides illustrate two significant themes from the qualitative study, and I urge you to consider and reflect on these alongside the other findings and also the final messages that I'll present in a few minutes. The first is the emotional impact of recurrence on men. Our findings here are comparable with the experiences of mothers, though there are gender differences in terms of how pain is expressed or defended against, but also how it's interpreted and responded to by professionals. Powerful emotions are not static. They overlap, they ebb and flow, they subside and intensify in different contexts and over time. And this is important to consider in relation to interventions and to service design and implementation. Some fathers experienced an incremental emotional shutdown, which was damaging to their own mental health and to their relationships, including with professionals. Other fathers actively resisted shame, using forms of bravado or fighting for their children as a means of defending moral and paternal identity. This often did not play well for them and could further isolate or exclude them. We also offer the idea of bearable guilt that seemed to allow some recurrent fathers to reconcile the legal outcomes for their children and their own part in what led to these, and which in turn allowed them to retain some stake in fatherhood. The second theme is reclaiming fatherhood. So it's important to recognise that most fathers in the qualitative study were attempting to make or sustain change in their lives, but that the resources they had to do that with were few and fragile. Almost all of the fathers were making efforts to reclaim their sense of father identity and fathering activity to some or all of their children, though of course with varying degrees of confidence, capacity and success. And this is another way in which assumptions of father absence or non-involvement need to be challenged and reviewed. Key factors associated with reclaiming fatherhood were some level of stabilisation or basic life security, such as housing, positive change in relationships with partners or mothers, responding to an opportunity to reconnect with a child, for example, a request for contact from their child. And reclaiming fathers wanted to prove to themselves, to their children, their partners and others, and of course professionals, that they could be reliable and credible parents. But change was not linear. It was much more often interrupted, stalled, fragile and hard-won. So I'd like to offer some final thoughts. Recurrent fathers are vulnerable. They may well pose risks arising from their vulnerabilities, but they should also be seen as at risk themselves. Fathers are arguably able to opt out of parenting in ways not available to mothers, but they are also much more likely to be seen as optional and thereby overlooked or marginalised. Fathers, like mothers in care proceedings, need both challenge and support. It's important to see fatherhood as generative and as a potential mechanism for behaviour change. Recognising and working actively with this might offer important alternatives to deficit perspectives of fathers and fathering. We suggest that we also need to think more expansively and creatively about fathers who are permanently separated from their children, can be supported to retain a stake in fatherhood which benefits those children in the future. And lastly, a simple but stark point. There is unmet need and a clear need for services to work directly and proactively with fathers. Thank you for listening.
Thank you to Claire and Georgia for presenting those findings. We'd like to hear your thoughts about what you've heard so far, so don't forget to add your comments to the chat and put your questions in the Q&A tab. We're really keen to hear from you. The presentations we've seen so far highlight that mothers and fathers need access to effective support services to help them make changes and break the cycle of recurrence. We're now going to show you a short film about a group of mothers who've been involved in recurrent care proceedings for their children. They explain how their circumstances and backgrounds have affected them and how, by making positive changes, they've been able to keep children in their care. They use their own words, but some of their parts are played by actors to protect their identities. The film was produced by a research team at the Centre for Family Justice Research at Lancaster University as part of a national project carried out between 2014 and 2017. It focused on birth mothers who'd appeared repeatedly before the family court in England. 72 mothers were interviewed, and despite having had previous children removed, nearly half of the women had a child in their full-time care.
It just hurts, and it always will do. I think that's why I did mask a lot of it with drugs. Physically, it does feel like someone's just squeezing your lungs, and just like you can't get that breath. It's like you're drowning.
Social services have been involved since I was a baby, so I'm quite used to it by now. My mum was on heroin. We got taken to live with my nan on a court order. She was so strict that I just didn't have a childhood really. She just wouldn't show us much love, and I think it was because she was so focused on making us not like my mum that she just forgot to love us a little bit.
Well, I'm adopted myself, and all the way through my childhood, I was like, I didn't have an identity, I didn't know who I was. No one would tell me anything about my birth side. I got a picture of my mum once. My relationship with my adopted parents broke down. I ended up going into care. I got abused and stuff. I was just chaotic in care.
I'd led a very chaotic life up to the point of having children anyway. I was brought up in care myself, so had no parenting role model. I'd just gone from one bad relationship to another. I was desperate to have a family because it's something I'd never felt part of. You know, that was the only thing that I really wanted, and in doing that I just made really terrible choices with partners. The first one was in and out of prison, so when my daughter was born, he wasn't there for any of it. So then I just went straight into another relationship quite soon, and he was violent. I ended up marrying him only because I was too scared to say no, and then I was too scared to leave him. And by this time I'd had 2 more children, and I asked social services for help, and a social worker came with the police to arrest him and took the children off me.
I started using heroin when I was 14 because I had a pretty bad childhood, so I feel like I used that to kind of forget about that. I was still using when I was pregnant. Well, I had my daughter, my first child, and honestly, I couldn't look after her. And then I found out that I was pregnant again, and I just couldn't cope. I could not go through that again. I couldn't look after 1 child on heroin, never mind 2. And then I ended up being sectioned.
When I was 6, I went into care on a full care order, and then they said that I needed 2 years counselling from when I was the age of 6 because my mum set fire to the house and she went to prison when we were 6, so we didn't have counselling from that. When I was 16, just turning 17, I got pregnant with my first daughter, and then I moved from the mum and baby unit and I started having issues at home. I felt like it was better to put her in on section 20 voluntarily. All the social care went, and then I was just left alone to do my own thing really. But yeah, she's been put up for adoption now, about 4 years ago.
I was 18 when I had my first child. He got placed in an adoption family. When he was 18 months, I found out I was pregnant with my second child. I didn't want to give birth to my daughter because I knew she was going to get took away from me, and I wanted her to still be with me. I didn't want to give birth. I slowed my labour down I didn't want her to come out. When I finally had her, they removed her 6 days afterwards. After a few months of me finding out that she wasn't going to come home, I ended up going on to more harder substances to mask everything.
I lost my kids 8 years ago. Heartbroken, like every birthdays, Christmases I couldn't cope with. And it's just really hard when I have to write a letter because I have to write it to the adopted mum, not the kids. So I have to be careful what I put in and not my feelings because it upsets the adopted mum. So.
After the kids went into care, I did drink a lot. It was my way of coping. Mental health had been an issue, and it was trauma-based. It was from what I was going through with domestic violence, stalking, harassment, and everything else around that stress-related. Getting really drunk, tried to jump off a balcony. The police were called, and from there, I knew that I could either carry on like that or things would have to change, and I chose to change.
I was already at a turning point where I didn't want to be who I was. I wanted to be someone with a purpose. I wasn't happy, and I knew that no matter how many times I mask it with whatever drug, there was no moving forward. And also I don't want my kids to look at me in the future, when they do come and find me, a mess.
And I met my husband. And that changed everything for me.
They put me in a mother and baby foster placement. Completely saved everything for me. It was like I had a family. It was just, I just loved it. Like it was like having a mum and a dad, and it was like your picture perfect family. They taught me how to look after my child, and in a sense, kind of taught me how to love.
I sort of relied on other people to tell me what to do and, you know, what I should be doing, and I thought, you know, I'm not happy with what they're saying. These are my children, and nobody's going to fight harder for my children than me. I'd got this computer and I'd not really touched a computer before, and so I ended up Googling loads of things, trying to find my, you know, what I could do. I turned a corner, I think walking out of the solicitor's office, that's when I thought, right, you know, I will take control, I will, you know, do my best for my children.
I called my local mental health service and started courses with them, various courses that addressed like anxiety, depression, coping with loss and change, and also went to a recovery programme that really concentrated on my behaviours and why I used alcohol as a tool to cope and how I could stop doing that.
I think it's like 5 and a bit years clean off hard drugs, and I've not smoked a fag or drank for 3.5 years. The social worker that they put in place was amazing. She was so understanding and went through everything and gave us support, and it resulted in me being able to take my son home and just be a family.
I love it. I don't know what I'd do if I couldn't wake up to my kids.
What's changed now is that I've grown up, I've got a partner that supports me, and I've got a beautiful baby. I've got a service what's helped me, and a worker I can trust because she's helped me and supported me, and she doesn't judge.
Thank you to those women for sharing their stories and demonstrating the huge impact that effective support can have. But what support services are available? To answer that question, I'm going to hand over to Susannah Bowyer, Assistant Director at Research in Practice, who is going to tell us more about the development of an interactive map showing services currently operating across England, including FDAC and PAWS practices, but also locally developed services.
At a national level, we've seen significant investment in PAWS, and the FDAC problem-solving courts, and the PAWS national team that enables the practice development of those services. We also have a cluster of evaluation studies for some of the smaller scale local services, and alongside these national evaluations of PAWS and FDAC, all contributing to building the evidence. But less evident until we undertook this mapping research is the range of small scale locally developed services around the country, and in some places the growing regional collaborations around this work, the work led by Strengthening Families in Greater Manchester being one strong example of this. This slide is showing the results of this mapping work led by Claire Mason, which we published in July 2021. The colour coding in the map gives you a holistic picture showing the FDAC areas, the PAWS practices, and in blue, these locally developed services. So the more focused aim of the mapping work, we wanted to give that holistic picture, but we also wanted, in the more focused aim of the mapping research, was to bring together knowledge about these small scale services around the country. The mapping work was done through survey and in-depth interviews. As you can see from this table, we identified 32 small scale services up and running with a further 6 in development. Most of these were being run through the local authority, with the third sector making important contributions around the country. The full mapping report is available on the Supporting Parents website, and you can see there whether you do or don't have recurrent services in the local area where you work. If you do have a local service, you might well want to contact those working in this field and bring them in to speak to your local LFJB, for instance. And if there is no service or very limited services where you work and it's not meeting the demand that you see in court, what questions might this raise for you in terms of regional variation? Are there local forums in which you might raise this as an issue for discussion? It's a developing field with new work emerging, but also, as you can see from that table, many areas with no service of this kind at all. Of course, it's a changing picture, a constantly changing picture. These services, working in a space where parents have for decades fallen through the gaps, are extremely vulnerable to financial cuts. In terms of our work, supporting the community of practice and developing this learning website, we are very glad to say that we've had new funding for 21 to 23 from the Siegelman Trust, and we will use some of that to update the mapping report on the website in the middle of summer 2022. So, as well as showing the location of these services, the mapping analysis outlines some of the core components that are common to all of the services working in this field. Some headline findings and some quotes from parents from a recent evaluation study illuminate some of the key points here. All of these services are working in what would broadly be called a trauma-informed way. By this we mean that services understand that attempts to cope with complex trauma, with loss and grief, in particular the loss of previous children in care proceedings, these experiences underpin many of the parents presenting problems and difficulties that they have engaging with professionals. So deepening practitioners' theoretical and practical knowledge and skills in trauma-informed work is shared in the community of practice and is developed on the ground. Respectful, honest and consistent relationship is the crucial means for enabling and supporting change. This may be the first time for many of these parents that they have experienced a healthy boundary relationship, and this acts as a vital starting point for them to reflect on their experiences and build change in their lives. Practitioner interviewees in the mapping study spoke of the importance of co-produced plans that respect a person's history and work to agreed goals at the parent's own pace. And we see from the quote somebody talking about their previous experience with social workers, their fear and anxiety and hiding away there, and contrast that with working with this service, having given them confidence and shown them what's possible and helping them build their relationship, not just with the recurrent care service practitioners, but also in fact with the children's services social worker as well, a really important finding. Practical support is another key aspect of the work that these services engage in with parents. Poverty, poor quality and insecure housing and debt are endemic in many of these parents' lives. And there's a focus on support to meet these basic needs. And we can see from the final quote on the slide that the difference it makes to be seen and recognised and for friendly support. The last point on the slide is around developing effective pathways into partner services. Practitioner interviewees were very frank about the challenges faced by parents trying to navigate the complex health and social care systems that we work within. The offer or difficulty in accessing any offer from adult mental health was a cause of particular concern, with waiting lists, thresholds, and specific service criteria all acting as significant barriers. A focus on sexual and reproductive health is a core part of all of the work of all of these services. There are also important differences between all of these locally developed services. So one is in relation to who those services work with. While many of these have initially focused on women, on mothers as parents, services are increasingly working with couples, and a small number are now working with fathers in their own right as well. There are concerns remain that services may not be effectively reaching families from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities who have experienced recurrent care proceedings, and there is needed work in terms of successful outreach. The majority of services that we mapped work with parents post-proceedings. On the other hand, a number are now working further upstream and offering support to parents before and through proceedings. This might include preconception work for parents considering having another child, or working with parents during a subsequent pregnancy, helping to address issues and aiming to keep the baby safe and well in their care. Others support parents through subsequent care proceedings. And then where those services are positioned in the broader social care system. There are some that are situated within the Children's Services Department, which raises both opportunities and challenges in terms of relationship building in a situation where a parent has already had children removed, a child or children removed by Children's Services, for instance. So as I've said, the work is happening in these gaps between services, between existing service tramlines and pathways, and as such is extremely vulnerable to funding cuts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susannah. Please don't forget to put your comments in the chat and put your questions in the Q&A tab. We'll now hear from some professionals running locally developed services. Karina Dyer from Comma in Stockport, Joe Garraway and Elaine Duke from Strengthening Families in Salford, and Jackie Holloway from Foundations in East Sussex. We'll also hear from a mother who worked with the Foundation service following the removal of her twins. She has since been able to keep a child in her care.
Okay, so the Comma project came out of an invitation that we had from the Centre for Child and Family Justice Research Department to take part in some research around recurrent proceedings for women. Around the same time, Stockport Family had realised that there was an issue around women who had children removed from their care and then got pregnant again, and then got pregnant again and went through the same thing. We are now building a team that's going to comprise of 4 workers. And also we have a link worker who's based at Stockport Women's Centre who supports women through the group process. So we work in a really different way to other services that women have experienced. Most women who come to us have had really negative experiences of being criticised, judged, being watched and assessed, all that kind of stuff. And it's really difficult for women to then trust another service who comes along and says, here, we're here to help you now. So we start, we try and meet them where they are, kind of psychologically and physically. We work in a really flexible way. So we're led by the woman. So we offer our service. If she chooses not to engage, that's entirely up to her. There's no expectation from us that she'll engage with us. We have to prove that we can be helpful. So we're quite persistent in our quest to engage women. but persistent in a gentle, kind way, I hope. So women might reject us initially because they don't know anything about us and they don't trust us, but we won't give up. But also, once that relationship is developed, we work in a really therapeutic way as well, because what we're hoping to help with is to help that woman to develop and to make changes that she needs to do, and to look at what she wants for her life in the future. So we look at what services she might find helpful, like mental health, like housing, like drug and alcohol services. And we kind of broker relationships between that woman and those services, because hopefully by this time she's learned to trust us a little bit, but she might not trust other services. So we will handhold, we will negotiate, we'll advocate, whatever she needs in order that she can access services in a more comfortable way. Judicial system really needs to think about what happens to that woman after that child is removed. And there needs to be some responsibility for services to ensure that that woman doesn't fall through the net at that point and not have any. It feels like services put her under so much scrutiny and stress, remove her child from her care and then go, bye, off you go. And that's not fair.
Strengthening Families was set up from a direct response from Salford City Council to the growing number of women who had repeatedly lost their children into the care system. And when we looked at Salford's data over a 7-year period from 2005 to 2012, 228 mums had 644 children involved in repeat removal cases. We know that families hadn't accessed the support and advice that they needed. So in 2014, Strengthening Families was established, and it sits within the early help part of children's services and is funded by the local authority through the DFE Innovation Programme.
In Salford, we have 3 different pathways. So we have a pathway A, which is our adult-only pathway, and that pathway, the criteria for that is for parents who've had their child removed. It's been through the courts and those proceedings have concluded. So what we do is we offer them a 2-year programme, and then we have a pathway B, which is the same scenario, proceedings have concluded for children who've been removed, and then the parent gets pregnant again, and then we offer a pre-birth service, and that's around the preparation for the social work assessment, and hopefully we can get those referrals in pre-20 weeks, because obviously the earlier we get that referral, the better it is in terms of looking at what needs to change within that family unit and how then those parents can demonstrate that change. And then if the baby gets to go home, we have a pathway C, which is a post-birth family support, and that's a 5-year programme right through to school readiness. We recognise actually fathers may need some additional support around their needs. So I think all too often, maybe particularly pre-birth services have a tendency to focus on the expectant mothers. However, right from the point of referral, we make efforts to engage the fathers in our programme. So what you sometimes see is a pattern. Those fathers may have children with different partners and experience recurrent care with different partners as well. So we want to break that cycle for them, and that's really important. We utilise the family partnership model, and that's a relationship-based model. The key in terms of engaging our parents is building a relationship with them, but having in mind utilising a trauma-informed approach. In the back of our minds, we always have that strong belief that everybody can make a positive change. So what we help them with is breaking that cycle of repeat removals. We want to build their confidence and self-esteem. We want to help them have more control over their life and building safe and healthy relationships, but also looking at the support networks and helping them to access other services, really, including contraception, drug and alcohol, mental health, support groups. And we want to keep families together, but keep them together safely.
The main issue for court, and one that I particularly want to highlight and feel really passionate about, is that during proceedings, the courts will often request that a family requires psychotherapy. However, there's often issues regarding access and thresholds in mental health services. There isn't a therapy for families that have had children removed. There isn't therapy for families to access counselling around the impact of them having a child removed and the long-term trauma, grief and loss. There's no long-term counselling with an emphasis on long-term, because imagine you having your baby removed from your care, how that feels as a parent. And some of our parents have had 10 children removed from their care. Other things that I'd like courts to consider is their language terminology in court. And quite a lot of our time, our practitioners that spend breaking down those barriers of what does that actually mean. As professionals, we struggle to understand sometimes that terminology. So for parents who have had children removed, feel very, very scared, are presenting in court, it's a big thing to have the right terminology so they understand.
I was asked to set up the foundation service in 2014 following a detailed analysis of care proceedings that had completed in East Sussex that showed that 70% of women completing proceedings had had a previous child removed from their care. So East Sussex response was to set up a small multidisciplinary team that sits within the umbrella of specialist family services to meet the need of this cohort of women. I refer to women, but we do actually work with fathers now. But when we started up the service, it was just for mothers who had had recurrent care proceedings. The foundation service provides trauma-informed, relationship-based practice, offering and delivering an assertive outreach approach to working with parents who have had recurrent care proceedings. So initially it's around engagement and building that very trusting relationship. And then looking at stabilisation. So in the early stages, just after proceedings, we look at stabilising in things around housing, finances. Many of the people we work with are very socially isolated. So it's about trying to get people back out into the communities. For some, and I think it's fair to say that we found since I've been doing this service that for many they want to go on and parent again in the future. So we work with parents around building up their skills, parenting skills, looking at what the recommendations of care proceedings were. So we work with them about making changes. This is a group of parents that historically have fallen through the gaps of service provision, so they're not able to access services. So for example, quite often within recommendations, they may say that a parent needs to access something within a mental health service, that they're not able to, they don't meet the threshold to be able to access that service. So we offer it in-house. So we provide, it's a completely bespoke service and it's not time limited. And we provide anything like healthy relationship work, mental health intervention, around sort of emotional regulation, distress tolerance, substance misuse intervention. And the thing that is absolutely come to our attention is really that the amount of women that are experienced and parents that are experience trauma. So we do have a trauma intervention pathways. Over the 8 years, we've brought the number of care proceedings within East Sussex for the women or the parents that have worked with us. We've managed to bring it down from 70% to 6%. It's been fantastic because we've had 26 women that we have worked with who've all had previous children removed. Some of them maybe have had 7, 8 children removed in their care. And between them now, they've got 33 children in their care. So they've gone on to successfully parent and retain the care of 33 children. So that's an amazing outcome for our service.
So I was pregnant with twins and obviously they got placed for adoption. So within 2 days of that final hearing, I got foundations involved. And obviously it was a really hard time for me and I had nobody. I was on my own. And so yeah, so I was really grateful that I got foundations so fast after that final hearing. Yeah, it was horrible. So I felt suicidal. I was at the lowest possible low. It's been highly beneficial. They got the court document and they went through all the recommendations of what I needed to do. And then they worked on building up my confidence, and so I had none. So when foundation first started working with me, they went like, I'm going to pick you up and we'll go for a coffee. And they've done it slowly. And I didn't have no trust in no professionals. And so it was building up on that trust with foundations and the workers. And then I just gradually they started taking me out and to a coffee shop. And then they were like, let's take you to a group to build up my confidence. And it was really beneficial because I worked on myself. I was so grateful that I got the service in so fast. But it has benefited me no end. I think there was empathy, there was kindness, there was no pressure to rush to take me out. They've done it at my pace. And I think if you have someone honest and they're telling you straight, I think that's where that trust you won't have the trust issues then. But it is based, I think a lot of it is, well, tell me straight, don't tell me one thing and then you're doing a different action. So if I have foundations when I first come to Hastings to the refuge, then who knows what the outcome may have been. And I look at my little girl and I'm like, am I dreaming this? Because it just doesn't feel real. I couldn't think, even back when she was born in 2018, I was so scared. I'm still scared to this day. And I think it's always going to be there. This, our social service is going to remove her. Are they going to come and take her? Honestly, I could talk about my little girl all day long. I really could. She's just amazing. I love her. And I was just so blessed to actually have managed to keep her in my care.
Thank you to those professionals and of course to the parent for sharing her experience. I'm now delighted to say that Sir Andrew McFarlane, President of the Family Division, will now reflect on what he's heard.
Once again, I'm very grateful to the Family Justice Observatory for pulling this research together and then delivering it in this very accessible way at this seminar. Anyone who's sat as a judge in public law cases will have experienced the sadness from a human point of view of all the professionals involved seeing a young mother and a young father losing a child because of the circumstances in their life and their history, rather than because they've got any deep-seated innate evilness or other intractable mental health difficulty. These are just young people who are stuck as a consequence of their background and their circumstances and a victim of what surrounds them. But there isn't time in the court process to unwrap that normally. FDAC and other models are exceptions. And so these interventions that have been described during the course of this seminar, I think are of the greatest importance. They demonstrate, and particularly the films of the mothers involved, that many of those people, all of those people, have the capacity to be a loving and good parent. And they want to love their child, but they're stuck in some way because of trauma in the past, because of dependence on alcohol or drugs now, because of relationships they're in, or no doubt because of a cocktail of all of those factors. The trick is to unlock the potential that sits inside these people, allow them to blossom into the parents that they can be, provide a turning point for them. What is the key that can unlock and provide that turning point? Well, the answer is there's a range of initiatives, and it's a mistake to think that just FDAC or just PAWS, which are the two prominent ones, are the right ones. And this seminar has shown that other ways of working, which are similar but different, can be established. And good news is that there's provision already there in quite a few areas of the country. I'm keen for that sort of intervention to be available everywhere. It shouldn't be a postcode lottery. So a question for you at this seminar is, what are you doing in your area, or what is being done in your area that you're aware of? Is this something that your local Family Justice Board ought to discuss? Might the materials that have been shared with us at this seminar be available for your local Family Justice Board to see if you can get initiatives such as this off the ground? I think local authorities should be and are likely to be very interested in this. This is social work of a true nature. It's very satisfying work. It's important because it's providing life-changing opportunities for people, many of whom are able to take them up. They just need someone alongside them, not in a judgmental way, not in the crisis of proceedings, but to help them move away from that which is confounding and containing their ability to be a parent and to move forward. This is inspirational stuff. It's important. And in fact, it's not rocket science. It just needs to be taken up around the country. And it will mean a win-win. It's a win, obviously, for the parents and children involved, but it's a win for the system. It takes cases out of the system that really shouldn't need to be there in the first place. So don't just leave this webinar and walk away and think it was interesting and important. Ask yourself what you can do locally and see if you can start, or others around you can start, an initiative like this if it's not readily available in your area.
Thank you very much, Sir Andrew. Well, I'm now very pleased to introduce our discussion panel. Claire Mason, Dr.Georgia Phillip and Susannah Bowyer are still with us, but we're also joined by Her Honour Judge Carol Berger from Birmingham and Solihull FDAC, Kerry Evans, National Development Officer at Reflect Cymru, and Jules Hillier, who's Chief Executive of PAUSE. We're going to try and address some of your comments and questions, so keep on putting those in the Q&A tab. So I'm going to come first to Jules. From PAUSE perspective, what do services need from the judiciary?
Well, I mean, I think both Karina from Comma and Joe from Strengthening Families talked really eloquently about some of the things that the local courts can do. And I think I would start by talking about language and the way that you communicate with families caught up in care proceedings. Women tell us all the time that they're confused, that they don't understand what has happened and that they don't understand the recommendations and the process they've been through. So I think the language you use is incredibly important. And then I think it's about knowing your local area and thinking about what services are available, because if you recommend a service that's not available or that isn't available to the parents that you're dealing with, then that can cause additional confusion and uncertainty and concern. And I suppose the third thing is thinking about who's accountable for making sure that those recommendations, when you make them, actually happen. Because in too many cases, as we heard from, I think it was Karina who was so powerful in that film, talking about women who, they get this recommendation, but then I think she says they go, bye, that's it. They're kind of left to their own devices. So I think it's the language. I think it's making sure you know what's available. I think it's making sure you know who is accountable for making sure things happen. And I also think that championing services for parents who have been through court proceedings and have lost children is incredibly important. And not just championing the services, but for those local authorities that don't already have a service in place for parents who have lost their children, making sure that they understand the issues. Because one of the things, I've been at PAUSE for nearly 5 years, and one of the things that never fails to shock me is when we talk to a local authority and they say, well, we don't really know the numbers, we don't really know how many recurrent care proceedings there are because the numbers aren't counted. So I think, before all of that, make sure your local authority knows the size of the challenge and is thinking about how to address it.
Thanks, Jules. Let me turn to Kerry, if that's okay, Carol. Sorry, we're trying to sort out your sound. I wanted to hear more about Reflect Cymru, if you perhaps could tell us a little bit more about it. There's been some comment in the Q&A about the fact that the services we've heard about this evening are really local services. but Reflect is a service which I think started in Newport and now has been rolled out across Wales. So perhaps you could tell us about how that happened.
Yeah, of course. Just a caveat, my connection isn't great, so I'm just been popping in and out, but we'll give it a go. Yeah, so thanks, Lisa, for the question. Yeah, Reflect developed in Newport, as you say, back in 2016, as a result of some scoping work done by the head of service there, Sally Jenkins, who used to be involved with Barnardo's Cymru. And they did the pilot. It was largely influenced by the development of PAWS and hugely by Professor Broadhurst in University of Lancaster's research, along with Claire Mason, who's on here today. It ran for 12 months originally in Newport and was evaluated by Cardiff University at the end of those 12 months, was very positively evaluated. And that evaluation was sponsored by Welsh Government. And then due to the positive nature of the evaluation, was then Welsh Government signed up to fund it across Wales on a pan-Wales basis from around 2018 onwards. So it's very much informed by the Newport pilot, which is working with parents once the children have been permanently removed at that point, really. And then it was rolled out largely on that model, although there were some existing services within Wales that predated 2016, where the model is slightly different, where they're sort of beginning their work with parents slightly earlier in the process, really. And so we've been going now for, as I say, on a pan-Wales basis since 2018. And my role as the National Programme Manager is to pull all the stats together for Welsh Government so that we can evidence the impact that we're making on a pan-Wales basis.
Perhaps you could just say what stage that evidence is at. Do we have any findings yet?
So we have a full year's report from last year, which is very positive. We did have a report the year before, but unfortunately, a bit like some of the other providers, we've got a range of providers in Wales. So we've got a lot of in-house provision, and we've also got ourselves in Barnardo's delivering to 10 local authorities and Action for Children, delivering in Mid and West Wales. So there's been a lot of work in trying to reconcile and make our reporting of performance indicators and outcomes consistent, and that's taken a little bit of time. But yeah, we have got some areas where we're able to evidence impact, around things like prevention of pregnancy, which we're really pleased with. So I think last year we were able to prevent pregnancy in 96% of women worked with across Wales, and we worked with, I believe it was just short of 340 women, mums, parents, on a pan-Wales footing last year.
And can I ask you, working with fathers as well as mothers?
Yeah, so we do work with fathers, and again, it's a little bit of a postcode lottery, if I'm honest with that, and some of that's to do with the resource. It's not a huge resource for some of the local authorities. We in Barnardo's do work with fathers, although it's fair to say that they are a significant minority in terms of the work we're doing. The work we tend to do is we're working with partners, really, so with mum and dad, rather than with dad specifically or exclusively. It tends to be if there's a partner there, if there's a relationship there with both partners are still involved, then we would work with both partners, and that would obviously include dads.
Thank you. So let me bring Susannah in here, because I mean this is a big theme to be thinking about. How do we go from small local services to something more of a national network of provision? What are the initial reflections from the work of the community of practice about the kind of factors that lie behind where services develop and are sustained?
Yes. I think I was just answering some Q&A in there. I think many of those local services were originally initiated by a passionate champion or a handful of people who could see the data, could see the Lancaster research, and could see those experiences of somebody coming in and losing 6, 7 children into care proceedings. So it's often been initiated in that way, and there's a real need for some of those quite isolated, sometimes quite small scale teams to be brought together and to have that kind of peer support that the community of practice is offering. People are really warm about what they're receiving from the community of practice, both from the centre, if you like, from Claire and other experts sharing their knowledge with the group, but really increasingly from themselves learning from each other, about working with fathers, for instance, where a service might want to expand into that area. So the costs, come from various different purses, and that's one of the challenges, is because it's working in that sort of gap between adult service delivery and children's services delivery. So there, so there can be some real challenges around that. The cost benefit case is really pretty compelling, and that national evaluation that was led by Janet Boddy for PAWS, the learning there is obviously specifically about the evidence that was gathered in relation to the PAWS service, but other services, small scale services have smaller scale evaluations that also point to a really compelling cost benefit case, both in money terms, but also as judiciary can well appreciate the human costs of having these people coming through the court again and again, and finding some practical ways to actually do something about that.
And just to follow on, in your presentation, you talked about some of the issues that the community of practice is addressing, including the question of diversity, not just needing to work with fathers as well as mothers, but also the lack of work with ethnic minority families. And it was very striking from our films in this session that there's a lack of diversity generally. What do you think can be done about that, and what is the community of practice planning to do?
I think first of all we need to understand a little bit more about data and about local data, and how to analyse that and use that to understand what is happening in different areas in different places. Then there's the work of that sort of sustained outreach that that PAWS and all of the other services really talk about as absolutely essential, and we can understand, can't we, that for people who've experienced child removal, in many cases the last thing that they feel is any sort of trust with service people coming and knocking on their door. So there's that, there's a real gap there. And then when you think about the additional challenges of racism or of experiences of poverty and deprivation that many minoritized families will have in our communities, additionally on top of the kind of challenges that they may well be experiencing that we've heard about in the course of these presentations, there's a real need to think very closely about how we properly engaging with minoritized communities locally, reaching out through through different kinds of networks, through local church networks would be one example, but there would be other ways to do that as well. Colleagues from PAWS and Bev from an FJO, Bev Barnett-Jones, did some initial sort of really interesting and important analysis work. And I don't know if Jules, if there's any, I know that you were taking that further at PAWS, weren't you?
Do come in, Jules.
Yeah, we are. We've got a programme of I think it's a bit grand to call it a programme of research actually, but one of the strands of our anti-racism action plan is around understanding better not only our own data, which we're doing a lot of learning from, but also the data, the comparable data in local authorities. And at the moment, all that's happening is we're asking more and more questions, the more data that we look at. So we, in common with, I think, many of the services out there, the vast majority of the women that we work with are white British. And we are really digging into the data to try and understand whether there are barriers to women from Black and brown communities accessing PAWS, whether there are barriers once they get to PAWS, do they get to us and we then don't respond appropriately, or are they not aware of services at all? And we're still at the beginning of doing some of that data work. Really, we have so we've got some. We're starting to look at outcomes data as well to see whether women whether there's a difference between different backgrounds and their outcomes on pause. But also we've started to look at something that, and it looks like there are differences depending on where referrals come from, or whether we're in a situation where we're not getting many referrals and we're having to rely on data. And one of the things that a kind of data trawl, and one of the things we're definitely seeing is that there are enormous gaps in data in this field. So if you start from the fact that anyway you're trying to find the women through the children's care records, very often the children's ethnicity is missing, but much more frequently the parents' ethnicity is missing. So I mean, at the moment what we're finding is just more questions and lack of information. But we are very committed, both as an organisation, but also with the community of practice, to trying to find out more and do more.
Thanks, Jules. And at the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory, we're really keen to help to try and fill those data gaps. I wondered if I could call on Georgia now to say a bit more about fathers, because throughout this evening we've talked about the need to ensure that services are working with mums and dads. But what do you think services need to be doing more of to ensure that that's effective?
Okay, can people hear me all right? Because my connection has been a little bit iffy as well. Yeah, I mean, I would start by reiterating that final point that I made in the presentation, that I think the research that we've done, it demonstrated the need and the unmet need. I think there is, from working with Claire as well, that, you know, and hearing the presentations from the professionals, there are some examples of such hugely skillful, sensitive, you know, strengths-based work going on. We know that is there, but I would still maintain that there's, you know, not an equivalent service response for fathers yet. That, you know, that many of the needs, many of the characteristics that we found in the research that we did are very, you know, there are so many similarities between the histories, you know, early life trauma, that kind of thing, that fathers and mothers have experienced, but the services are lagging, I think. And I would still also reiterate the importance of working with couples. I think the findings from the CAFCAS analysis, that when you look at who fathers return with, that proportion of fathers who actually come back with the same partner, I think is a really interesting finding that we need to reflect on and dig into. So it may be that in terms of developing proactive, you know, generative, strength-based work with fathers, that's a combination of services that work with couples, but also, yes, services that will work specifically with fathers, but maybe incorporate many of the same elements, you know, the long-term nature of it, the holistic nature of it, the need to be trauma-informed, all of that stuff is just as appropriate for fathers. I think somebody in the Q&A put a point about you know, how can we think about developing best practice ideas? And I would very much want to sort of contribute or just argue that needs to also incorporate commitments to, you know, again, proactive father inclusive work, working with couples, that kind of thing. You know, the same worries that are out there around services for mothers in terms of sustainability, longevity, you know, short-term funding, you know, all of that stuff is true as well for services for fathers generally, let alone fathers who are in this cohort of particularly marginalised or vulnerable, you know, vulnerable men. You know, I would say there needs to be greater confidence, greater willingness to kind of hold that tension of the combination of vulnerabilities, risks, and needs that many fathers in repeat care proceedings present. My sense is that there is a greater confidence already to be able to contain that in the work, in the really skillful work that happens with mothers, but there is not yet, you know, enough of that kind of work that's prepared to take that approach, you know, with many other fathers.
Thanks, Georgia. That it feels like an area.
I could go on, but I won't.
It feels like an area that's ripe for development, as you say, building on what we've already learned. I'm wondering whether I could ask whether Carol can be heard now. Let me return to the question that I asked you, though, because I think it would be a good place to wrap up this evening. What messages or advice would you give to members of the judiciary who are watching the webinar? What could they be doing next if they are interested in really trying to address the level of recurrence in their areas? What could they be doing?
I think, Lisa, you will have seen, as will everybody, the map that showed just how many family drug and alcohol courts we have nationally. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm the lead FDAC judge at Birmingham. And I was privileged enough also to be an FDAC judge at Milton Keynes, and in fact was one of the first judges there when the Milton Keynes FDAC was created in 2014, being the third FDAC in the country. So I come from a perspective of understanding FDAC. And my background is as a solicitor. And one of the things I think I want to start by saying is really echoing what the President has said, that the webinar for me actually has really enthused me, because we're having debates that Nick Crichton was having in as long ago as 2008 when he started the FDAC, and when he focused on the issue of recurrent care proceedings and the impact on parents and ultimately the impact on children. And for me, though, we've moved forward because I'm talking to you now, I know there are 15 FDACs across the country. When we started in Milton Keynes, we were number 3. So I know that the model of FDAC that Nick wanted to see is growing. And what I would say to those judges who are in areas where there isn't an FDAC is keep up the pressure of getting one. I know the challenges. I mean, believe you me, having set up the Birmingham FDAC only 8 months ago, and taking everybody with me from when I came back to Birmingham in 2018 and having those discussions with all of the stakeholders, all of the partners, including the police, including health, including social care, education, housing, and so on. I know how challenging the task is. But the one thing I also know is that with over 60%, and I got this from the very recent report prepared by the Centre for Justice Innovation, with over 60% of care proceedings involving substance misuse as a critical issue, we need more FDACs. And the President has repeated this message, and I know Sir James repeated the message. But that's my starting point, is that if you don't have an FDAC in your area, then have that debate and try and engage the local authorities that you serve in looking at what the positives are about FDAC, looking at the financial case for FDAC. And for those who don't have it, there was a recent study that came out from the Centre for Justice Innovation only as recently as September, which set out the business case for having FDAC and how that has long-term implications, importantly for families and children, but also in terms of cost. I would also say this about when I was fortunate enough to think about participating in the webinar, there were 3 things that came to mind immediately: choice, opportunity, and outcomes. And choice, because we need to increase the ability for parents to have that choice of entering FDACs. And the other thing that I wanted to underline is that where we have FDACs, it underlines and it's a beginning of a process that empowers parents, because they make the choice of coming into it or not, and they're enabled to do that. And that's step 1 of their journey in trying to turn their lives around and do things differently. The other thing was opportunity. And if you want any argument for why we need more FDACs, it's because they give parents that real opportunity. And they do so because of the collaborative partnerships that are built in the course of proceedings with other agencies, like the wonderful agencies that we've heard from tonight. And they give you the opportunity as a judge to really find out what is there on the ground and to start building those relationships. But importantly, they give parents that ability to work at the relationships that they have with professionals, to get to know their judge positively through the non-lawyer review process, to hear a judge and someone in authority saying to them, you are doing well, and encouraging them. And all the research that has been done around FDAC tells us that is pivotal in helping parents achieve their goals and achieve the changes they want to achieve. So I would say this as well, that when I came back to Birmingham, I tried doing some of what I'd done in Milton Keynes without an FDAC. That of itself was a challenge. Trying to draw in professionals, getting them talking to each other from the outset of a case, asking them to share expertise, asking them to come up with an intervention plan for a parent that they could work through in the course of proceedings, that then would follow through in terms of what the aftercare services were for parents. I managed to achieve it successfully in one case, and the reason for that is I didn't have access to the multidisciplinary team and the expertise and the central factor, an agency that was able to bring all of that together for me. I would also say this to you as well. In the 8 months that we've had Birmingham and Solihull running, parents have repeatedly said to me, it's the first time I've been listened to. I really appreciate the support I get and how important it is and what a difference it makes. And one of the things I want to emphasize about the Family Drug and Alcohol Court is the outcomes are not just about children returning to parents. That someone observed our FDAC only last week, they saw 5 non-lawyer reviews, 4 mothers were engaged in education in those non-lawyer reviews. I could go on, but the importance of that in building self-esteem and confidence in parents, and then helping them and engaging them in the discourse about what happens to their children, particularly if they're not able to care. So those are all the arguments for FDAC. And clearly, if you've got an FDAC, you're already ahead. If the challenge of getting an FDAC is too great, then I just want to emphasize what the President has said, that for me, it's about understanding local resources. It's about understanding the early help services that are available to families and how they are engaged. And it's about drawing in services as far as you're able to in care proceedings that will support parents through those proceedings, enable them to have a voice, an effective voice that's not one filtered just by lawyers, and that will go on to support families over the longer term. And I'm continuing and evolving our FDAC with the judges locally, with all the professionals and agencies that are involved, to ensure that whatever happens, we develop a culture that means that we have that available to all of us citizens.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you so much. It's such a powerful and passionate message, and a great place to draw our discussion to a close. I'm afraid we are out of time, but I want to thank you all for attending today's event, and especially to our panel and our presenters and contributors, and to Sir Andrew McFarlane and everyone else who took part. If you'd like to download the research, you can find it on our website, nuffieldfjo.org.uk. You can also sign up to our regular bulletins at nuffieldfjo.org.uk/subscribe. I know there's a note being put into the chat. We'd love you to fill in an event feedback form. It helps us to design future events. We'd be very grateful if you could. But most of all, we look forward to welcoming you to future webinars. Thank you very much.